All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Brian Morrissey. I run a company called The Rebooting. We have a podcast, we have a newsletter, 2 podcasts actually, do events. I spent my life in journalism, but mostly covering the business of journalism, the business models that allow journalism to exist, right? And I think this is a wonderful event because it brings together journalists, and a lot of times the events I go to are all about the business side. But really at the end, I think what we're all after is we're at this time of tremendous structural change in media markets, and the question is how we build sustainable models. And that's what the rebooting is all about. That's what a lot of my work really focuses on. And I think it's a worthy mission because journalism is a difficult business in a lot of ways because there's a civic good that journalism does, and that sometimes runs up in opposition to business needs. So running any business is really difficult, but I feel like running journalism businesses is particularly difficult. And so I could think of no one better than Peter Erdelyi. I have a Hungarian pronunciation problem, but the most important thing is that Peter is from the Center for Sustainable Media. Correct, Peter?
It was excellent on both counts.
That's a total lie. So we're going to talk about, and I think we mostly have similar perspectives, but we're going to play up some of the differences. I'm going to try to lean into my Americanness as much as I can about how these markets get shaped, right? And so, Peter, I want to start with you. I mean, you're Hungarian, right? And so just had an election, right? And it's a bit of a changing of the guard, end of an era in Hungary. And I think it's an interesting perspective that you have with how to build these sustainable business models, because you saw and experienced, what happens when, there's a capture of the media ecosystem. So give us I assume you're optimistic now about the changes? Maybe not. I don't know. You could come out as an Orbanist.
I am somewhat optimistic about the changes. So yeah, I'm from Hungary. As you may know, it's currently the press freedom capital of Europe, Budapest. And we have had a government in place for 16 years, and the government spent quite a bit of money capturing various media outlets. And they interfered on the advertising market, so it was very difficult to be a sustainable business in journalism. And then, because it was so difficult, some government-friendly businessmen could swoop in and buy these properties, and then the government consolidated, which we ended up with with an ecosystem that was 60, 70, 80% captured. What I think was maybe a little bit of a miscalculation on their part, that they really invested in this money on the institutional side. So really broadcasters, radio stations, TV channels, and so forth. But those lost relevance quite a bit in Hungary, just like everywhere else in the world. So there was this structural shift where people started to get more information through platforms, started to get more information from individual creators, from very small, I think Brian likes to say, information entrepreneurs. Yeah. And those systems are a lot harder to capture because it's decentralized. That has its problems, and I think people in journalism look at those changes suspiciously, and I think sometimes for a good reason, but it also makes capture so much harder. So what ended up happening is this empire that they built with spending, hundreds of millions of euros ended up not being very useful at the election, and they lost by a historic margin, and now we have a new government. Short term, I'm cautiously optimistic. Long term, it's not a Central Eastern European trait to be very optimistic, so I'm not.
Yeah. I mean, this is like a sort of good news, bad news situation, right? I mean, I think the sort of good news is state capture of media is harder than ever, right? More good news is content, and journalism is a form of content, is more valuable than ever. Like, I am always like reflecting on, in the United States, how the tech elite and the venture capitalists are obsessed with media. They all want to create media, and that's because they understand how powerful it is. At the same time, the sort of bad news is the traditional ways of making a business out of media have collapsed. It's a monetization problem. It's not necessarily I don't even think it's necessarily a market demand problem for information. Now, one of the things that I think about a lot, and we had talked about this last night, is one of the things I love about this event is that it's a great reminder that journalism is a craft and it's a guild of sorts. And that is like a guild because I did a podcast one time with Ben Smith, who used to be the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News and is now the editor-in-chief of Semaphore. And when he was reflecting on how difficult journalism businesses are, he said one of the hard parts is journalists work for the guild. They don't work for the company. And that creates a whole bunch of tension and conflict within that. And I think on top of that, one of the things that I think about a lot is how journalism exists within a larger information system. And in that information system, there are all kinds of competing forces now. Because before it was like kind of a cozy system. Yeah. Like, you had, which presented risks. So when you decentralize the information ecosystem, you get a lot of what I euphemistically call information entrepreneurs. People who use sometimes the trappings of journalism. They can kind of look a little bit like journalism. It's kind of like processed foods in some ways. They might look like food, but they're not really food. They're artificial, right?
Yeah. Cake or not.
Yeah. And so the question is for me, from an American perspective, I think about that and I say, well, how do you compete, right?
Yeah. I think that's partially difficult because, a lot of people in and around journalism is very invested in process and maybe less invested in outcomes. And I think if you are invested in processes that maybe worked 10, 15 years ago, but maybe not as relevant today, you'll be out-competed by all sorts of actors. You'll be out-competed by individuals that are doing, an information service. You'll be out-competed by big tech in many ways. I think the other problem is this, I think, true both in the US and Europe, but maybe Europe sometimes can be a little bit more difficult, is that some information service is needed for society. It's a public good, but there is no longer a business case for it. And then what happens? And I think here you have, in the US, more philanthropy. In Europe, you have more public sector support. But if you structure these things wrongly, you're shielding people from the market, and you have bad incentives, and you'll have some systems that are really not working very well.
You're like basically you have market failures that do exist, I believe, in these systems, right? And mostly, like, we were at like a local news gathering, and local news is probably the heart of where there's a lot of market failures. And I think one of the things that I'm always reminded of coming from the U.S. to Europe is, the U.S. is obviously a very big country, and it's a very deep market, deep capital markets. The advertising economy is very large, very challenging market, very competitive, but at the same time, a lot of advantages that smaller markets simply don't have, and those probably will have more market failures. So you want to correct for market failures. The market cannot provide all. Even as American, I will admit that, Peter.
Yeah. Note this down when he said this.
I know, it hurts me. At the same time, intervention in these markets creates distortions. And intervention can also create dependencies, really. I went to a journalism event in Kyiv before the war, and I went to this accelerator, and I heard all the pitches and everything, and I was always like saying, what is your business model? Again, I know the role I'm supposed to play. And almost everyone was dependent on USAID. I was like, that's not good. Because we keep talking about trust, and I don't think you're going to be trusted if you're getting funding basically from the US government, okay? And I worry that having too much public funding will lead to not enough focus on winning in the marketplace with really great products, and a dependency and almost a complacency.
I think this is where we have maybe a little bit of debate, and not
Let's
about...
go. Come on.
Yeah, let's fight it out. I think in the US, you have a very large and developed philanthropic sector. You have various people with money and organizations that are willing to invest this money not on a market logic. I see that as not really different than European solutions for public sector support. And I give you that
I think they're both terrible, though. I think that they're a small part of an information system that is going to be driven by market forces. And maybe that's because like capitalism is so dominant like in America that I can't imagine it changing. I know obviously Europe has a different approach to its markets and intervenes a lot more in some ways. Some ways it doesn't actually. It's more free marketeer, but go on, sorry.
No. But do you think, like, I think USAID support for, there is something, why is it important for the US taxpayers? But I'm not sure if the product is good enough. I don't think the audience will ultimately care that much, because the audience doesn't care about the process that much. This is a lot of output legitimacy. They are interested in whether this information is reliable and is it relevant for my life. I think how is it funded is more interesting for journalists and media managers.
No, I hear you. Like whether it's a 5013C and these tax designations they talk about in the US a lot, doesn't matter. And to me, the main concern is when you go, I always say, when you go into the market will tell you what it wants. A lot of times it's not going to be what you want to hear, unfortunately. But the market will tell you what you want, and you should create better products. This exists. Imagine the technology industry if the technology industry was not responding to signals from the market. And I guess my concern would be if you're not exposed to the market, you're not going to get signals. I saw this with venture capital, because there's a lot of distortions that happen. Venture capital funded a lot of publications in the United States in the last generation of companies. They don't do that as much anymore because they were mostly disasters. Vice, BuzzFeed, Vox, Mike, all these different different outfits. And almost all of them failed, right? And almost all of them overhired. All of them did not have the discipline that the market enforces on you to create better products that are going to resonate with the audience. And my concern would be if grants, whether it's from governments or from philanthropy, become so dominant, it becomes an inside game of you start to excel at applications, not at like creating products that people really want and add to their lives.
But I think that is a mechanism question, and I agree with you. I think the more market signals and the benefit of the market is you have good information and you can be responsive to it. But yeah, I think there are some use cases where markets is not there or very weak, and then you need to step in. And for me, then it doesn't really matter if it's like a rich person and their largesse or their whatever, or if it's a state.
I don't trust the rich people. I got to be honest with you. The history of billionaire ownership of media assets in the United States is terrible.
It's a mixed track record. I would say,
to put it mildly.
Yeah, but then
even the good billionaires turn out to be terrible at this business. I thought Bezos was the good billionaire, and he screwed that up royally at the Washington Post.
I mean, it's hard to stipulate, but I think he did not necessarily. He bought it for a nice line in Wikipedia initially, and then, like, for him to look nicer, his statue, and then later on, I think it's a political tool to leverage that he can wield in terms of.
But that's traditionally, at least in the U.S., like rich people wanted to own media assets. One, for the parties. The parties are important. Let's be real. Number two is they want political influence. Again, media is incredibly valuable, and it's leverage. I mean, Rupert Murdoch started in some like little town like in Australia, and he clawed his way up, and it's like to influence. this is not lost on our new oligarch class, right? So I don't necessarily, it might be very Gen X of me, but I don't trust.
But do you think that OpenAI, like they bought TVPN?
TVPN, yeah.
TVPN. Do you think they will be good owners of this? Isn't there something inherently they bought it because it's an end to a mean, and then it will corrupt, not in the most malicious way, it just degrade the quality because they will be less reliant on market signals because they have backing, and also because the backer has an agenda.
Right, and that's a great example. So TVPN, for anyone who doesn't know, there's actually a European version of it called ETN. It's a technology streaming show that started a couple years ago and just got sold for about $200 million from what I was told. And it got bought by OpenAI. And this is not a journalistic endeavor, but it looks like journalism a little bit.
It is an information endeavor.
It is, but it looks like CNBC. It has little tickers and things like this. It has a set, and so it takes on the aesthetics of journalism, right? The guys who run it are very friendly to tech. They're very optimistic about tech. I think I'm not going out on a limb to say that in general, the Journalistic Guild is not optimistic about tech's role in society and our economy. And so that provided them with leverage, because guess what? Powerful people in tech really like when media tells everyone how important what they're doing is. So to me, it was just a reminder. They would have about 70,000 people who would ever, some of their streams would have like 700 people on them, right? But they were bought for $200 million. It doesn't really make sense in the logic of the market. But the logic of the market, sometimes when it comes to information, there's different forms of leverage, right?
And also because I think it doesn't need to make sense for the narrow market of, are they going to be able to kind of get this money back with their audience? It makes sense because their agenda is to shape perceptions around the tech product, and they see it as a good vehicle for that.
But what I would argue is that journalism needs to compete with these information products, if you will, that are using the aesthetics and the trappings of journalism, but do not have, they're not part of the guild, right? That means they don't get to come to Perugia, which is a downside. But the upside is they don't have to be speaking truth to power. They can suck up to power, and they can benefit from that quite a bit. I mean, the Free Press is another great example, right? This is a journalistic organization, right? But it just so happens that the point of view of the Free Press lined up perfectly with what rich and powerful people in the United States want out there in messaging. And they got bought for a lot of money.
150 million, yeah.
Yeah. And so, to me, it says a few things. One is, all the people who usually are in tech and other fields who claim that the market incentives are to be oppositional and tear down and write hit pieces are completely full of shit. And then the other thing it tells me is that this is a real challenge about how you compete with these other kinds of products out there, because otherwise the market is going to be defined by these.
But do you think, because I think looking at it from afar, in the US, even the more traditional journalistic institutions are interested at least exploring what competition looks like. And I think some, like The Atlantic, is better at capturing this energy of the individual and building brands and whatever. Whereas in Europe, I think a lot of the more traditional players in the market are sheltered from the market through maybe state subsidies that are not applied well, or they have a lot of inertia and incumbent advantage because the advertisers are not really responding to the attention that quickly, and then are less willing to compete. Do you think the large journalistic organizations in the US are ready to capture the energy of the individual creator, or or who is more successful and why?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big shifts that we're seeing, and this is one, also another challenge, is, we're seeing a shift from institutions to individuals, right? And we're going from inherited, because we talk about trust all the time, right? And it's just a nice thing to say a lot of times, and you don't sort of dig into it. But a lot of times when I hear trust mentioned in journalism, it's almost talked about as a right, it's inherited trust. It's like, no, we're trusted because we're journalists. Those people are not journalists, even though journalism is not an accredited profession. There's no sort of bar exam to take. There's no sort of legal certification, and I hope there never is. I don't know, maybe you guys will do that here. I hope we don't do it in the United States. I don't want the government to be licensing journalists. But that ends up being a challenge because individuals end up having inherited trust, or not inherited trust, excuse me, earned trust. And that is so much more powerful right now in the marketplace. And I think the question for a lot of institutional media brands is, how can they harness some of that earned trust and earned energy and still fulfill their missions, right? Because again, you're always almost in tension when you're trying to fulfill a journalistic mission, which is a civic good, right? And then you're also competing with Tucker Carlson, out there, who's really good at capturing attention. Because you're in an attention economy, and the attention economy has a different set of incentives.
Yeah, I see a lot of, especially around when it's not only that it's an individual and it's a different type of actor, but also like Tucker Carlson, it's politicized. And then you'd have these very weird discussion in some institutions. Oh, there should be a cordon sanitaire. We shouldn't engage with these people because it gives them a platform.
Yeah, don't platform them.
And it's what are you talking about? Their platform is 4 times the size
right.
of yours. It's in this ecosystem.
He's calling up the president on his cell phone.
Yeah, it is. I still think that maybe because, again, institutions here are sometimes more sheltered from the market, there's less experimentation on how to capture this earned energy and yeah.
So how do you think about that, though, with your work, right? Because, how do you think about the role of, look, news has always been a subsidy business. It's always been subsidized. Newspapers subsidized the investigative reporting, the hard news with the food section, with comics, with horoscopes, all kinds of things that were not, I guess, when we talk about journalism here, are not really thought of. Service journalism was a nice sort of euphemism for these things, because you had to subsidize. There isn't these deep investigations are not economically viable, right? And so you need to find subsidies. But then at the end of the day, how do you square that circle with?
Yeah, I think that sometimes you talk to someone who has a publisher, a newsroom running, and they're asking for advice how to make it more sustainable, and they also have a bar on the side that is doing well, and they're how can I create synergies? And you could tell them maybe just stop the journalism business and you'd be more profitable. Yeah. But of course that's not the point of the exercise. I think it really depends on what you're trying to subsidize with. And here I think Europe is also more conservative. There are organizations that would not be willing to do, if they would feel, okay, but food, it's beyond, it's not who we are, or the purity of our purpose is really just the news, and that's really hard. But I don't think it's limitless, because I know for a fact that you, Brian, if you heard, prediction markets are subsidizing news journalism, you would not be comfortable with that. You can choose what to take money from. I think we need to accept the fact that news itself is not profitable. Maybe it's never really been profitable, but then where do you get the money from? And even the market sometimes, because prediction market is just a very buttoned up world for gambling.
I mean, prediction. I have deep unease with the rise of prediction markets in the U.S. I feel like we were behind on like gambling, and then like it was kind of like cell phones. We just sort of went like way too far. But I do think that they're going to create, a lot of news organizations are making these deals with prediction market companies. Kalshi and Polymarket are the biggest ones. And look, it's going to be like a gold rush of money. These are new industries that are springing up. I think that they're extractive and there's not much societal good that comes out of these industries. But they're going to be fighting over getting their user bases as big as possible because they have a high lifetime value. And so news organizations are going to end up getting in bed with them. But I think one of the things that I think about down the line is inevitably journalism is going to be used for self-interested purposes. And that is going to be part of the competitive landscape. Journalistic organizations are likely in the future to be a minority of the people practicing quote-unquote journalism. You're going to have people who are front-running prediction markets by using journalistic tools. Like I'm sure you're familiar with like Hunter Brook. Really interesting model of using investigative journalism and combining it basically with a hedge fund. I mean, this is a model that could only be born in the United States of America, I feel
So
like.
I think people, so for those of you who are not like that invested in niche models, Hunter Brook has a lot of money. They invest in capital markets, and then they have an investigative newsroom. They figure out someone is doing something wrong. They will publish it Monday morning, and the minute they publish it, the hedge fund takes up a short position in the company that they are exposing, expecting the share price to drop and make money on this. There are some exploration in Europe, whether it's doable here, but of course here again the problem is, I think these things need to be tried, but the incentives are kind of hard, and it really depends. I think Hunter Brook, one of their latest investigation was this US hardware company and their tools ending up in Russian drones in the Ukraine front. That was, I think, public service for that to be exposed. I don't care that much if they made money on shorting the stock of this company. I'm more interested in output legitimacy. But then, I don't know, they wrote an article about like a faulty something in a Winnebago, which didn't feel public service to me. And then suddenly I wasn't sure, okay, what is the real purpose here? I think there is going to be a lot of like uneasiness in journalism, trying to figure out, okay, this model, is it inherently wrong or right? No, it will depend on what kind of story they pursue.
It's figuring out the subsidy, right? Like, I mean, like I think for Hunter Brook or these kind of models, some of the like non-self-interested investigative work will be done for marketing purposes. And it's very like uncomfortable, I feel like, within the profession to talk about that. The reality is Bloomberg News, mostly, it exists. Its core function is as a marketing for the terminal. That is the business. It is subsidized by the terminal. It is like quasi-profitable, but this is another form of subsidy. It's not state subsidy, but it's a form of one, and I'm sure we're going to see more of these models out there. But to me, the question is like what creates a better products in the market? You know, like what is going to end up leading to fulfilling that civic mission, right? Along with having a vibrant information ecosystem. Because for all the problems that we always go through with, you know, this industry, I also like am reminded that I'm like very well served with information products, like very well served. I get a lot of great journalism from the New York Times. Very successful model, very good business. It's possible to have like a very good, it's probably the exception to the norm. You know, you go through the list, Financial Times is doing great. These are all particular publications that are focused on basically rich people at the end of the day. And so I think the market itself is not completely malfunctioning, but there are just sectors that, parts of the market that where it's malfunctioning.
But then I think the danger is when you get involved with subsidies of either philanthropic or public sector, you really need to design them in a sense that it doesn't perverse the incentive for those who could have a market case and really help in a way for the underserved sectors of the market that will not catalyze further dependence. I think that's, we are it.
We are late. We are out of time. But I wanted to get to the question, but we're not going to get to it. Anyway, thank you all for coming. Hopefully it was, thought-provoking a little bit. I want to thank Peter for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.